Right, well, welcome to the second session of our Liberty series, Political Thought Reading Club presents Locke and Paine, presented by me, Samuel Woodall, a PhD candidate in intellectual University of Buckingham. And yeah, we're going to be looking at two godfathers of liberty in their own ways, John Locke and Thomas Paine. So, first of all, John Locke, a sort of proto-Enlightenment figure, or at least a very early Enlightenment figure. He's known for his contributions to philosophy, politics, epistemology. His essay concerning human understanding introduces the concept of the tabula rasa, arguing that the mind begins as a blank slate, acquiring knowledge solely through experience. This empiricist view challenged traditional notions of innate ideas such as Plato's forms or the Christian doctrine of original sin. In A Letter Concerning Toleration, Locke further advocated the separation of church and state that had been undergone since the Reformation, promoting religious freedom as essential to individual and societal well-being. Locke's political philosophy, most notably in the Two Treatises of Government, laid the foundation for modern liberal democracy. He emphasised natural rights, life, liberty and property, and argued that governments derive legitimacy from the consent of the governed, not via divine authority. This is the text from which the chapter we will be looking at today originates. But first of all, I'll just go through the texts in slightly more detail in terms of some contextual stuff. So he was writing prodigiously in 1689, the first of which, the Essay Concerning Human Understanding, is not merely a defence of Enlightenment empiricism, but a celebration of the individual's capacity for rational discovery. Central to the work is Locke's concept of the tabula rasa, the idea that the mind begins as a white paper void of all characters without any innate ideas or knowledge. This challenges traditional epistemological views such as Plato's forms or the Christian doctrine of rasa peccati, original sin, which suggests humans possess inherent traits or universal concepts. In the context of the 17th century, Locke's rejection of original sin was very provocative, as it opposed long-standing religious and philosophical traditions. However, with the decline of Catholic influence in post-Stuart Protestant England, such ideas found fertile ground. And actually, Locke, a little side note, Locke was actually involved in some of the attempts to assassinate James II, depending on how much people know that sort of late Stuart politicking, but he housed some of the Rye House plot assassins and helped them escape to the Netherlands. Locke argues that knowledge originates entirely from experience, grounding his epistemology in observation and rational inquiry. Later, scholars like Bernard Mandeville critique Locke in Fable of the Bees, suggesting Locke overlooks the role of human passions in shaping individual and societal development. Then there's the Letter Concerning Toleration. So John Locke, again, writing during the early Enlightenment, addresses the concept of tolerance in another 1689 work, A Letter Concerning Toleration. Locke argues that tolerance is a Christian virtue, emphasising that matters of faith should be free and voluntary. He critiques the continued intertwining of church and state, asserting that men's souls cannot belong to the magistrate, meaning that religious authority should not be dictated by the state or its officials. For Locke, true faith arises only when it is uncoerced, reflecting his broader advocacy for the separation of religious and political institutions. Locke's call for religious tolerance arose amidst 17th century England's religious and political turmoil, including the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. In this era of persecution and enforced conformity, Locke's A Letter Concerning Toleration argued for separating church and state, emphasising that true faith must be voluntary. Influenced by his Protestant background and experiences in more tolerant societies, such as when he went to the Netherlands, Locke's work laid the groundwork for modern liberal thought. And then the text that we're looking at today, the Two Treatises on Government. Locke's Two Treatises on Government in 1689, particularly chapter 8 of the second treatise, addresses the origins of political society and the foundations of social contract theory. Writing in the wake of the Glorious Revolution, Locke challenges the notion of a divine right monarchy, instead arguing that legitimate political authority arises from the consent of the governed, He explains that individuals in the state of nature agree to form political societies by mutually consenting to a social contract to protect their natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Again, those three pivotal concepts. Locke contends that political power is entrusted to governments to serve the common good, but this power remains conditional on the preservation of those rights. If rulers betray this trust, citizens have the right to dissolve the government. Locke's ideas in this chapter profoundly influence the development of modern democracy and the philosophical underpinnings of constitutional government. This is what we shall look at first. So I put some questions up there. Jack, you might want to start us off, or if anyone has come with a particularly poignant question to open the discussion, and we'll do that for about 20 minutes, half an hour, before we move on to looking at Paine and then some of the influence of Paine, of Locke on Paine. So yeah, Jack, it's up to you unless anyone else wants to go.
I'll start. First, it came to mind as you were talking about. I'm very interested in Locke's understanding of freedom. I quite like the idea that in a fundamental way you are born with freedom in the way that right. However, it's not particularly a functional freedom, and one must learn how to feel it effectively. Because there's so much complexity to the world. Ignorance of the development force. And so one must develop a certain degree of prudence. I would say prudence. Be free. Now, Locke, specifically, he says that it is reason. That would be to Rousseau, who would say, I think, have to grow in virtue. That's interesting. And then what struck me about what you were saying was I hadn't connected this doctrine idea of the blank slate. I didn't make that connection. And so I'd like to know more about what that relationship is, because that's also a place where he and Rousseau connected the blank slate. Those themes, they were first saying
the only thing that when you said about the Locke was still very religious.
Oh yes, yeah, very much so.
Saw that provided this sort of that freedom. So it wasn't freedom. Kind of do something which is different to, I think, Hobbes, who basically wasn't quite as easily as wide.
Definitely. And I think it's an interesting sort of tension between the idea of the tabula rasa, the sort of blank state mind, and how does that become a sort of tendency towards freedoms, right? And sort of bouncing off of what you're saying, Peter, very much so in terms of his religiosity, and also the type of consent that he believes a social contract is formed by, and we were discussing this, is the idea of what's called tacit consent, that it's not a full voluntarism like in a Rousseauian society that we were discussing that you opt into because you realise that society will ultimately be the sort of formative for the common good, but actually it's a tacit consent that you take part, you become a part of the state simply by the fact that you're taking part in it. So the fact that you've grown up and accepted its kind of benefits, its kind of support network for you as a child, as a young man, as a young woman, growing up in it, operating within it, that is what he defines as tacit consent. So yeah, he certainly doesn't believe in a sort of radical freedom, because you're automatically obliged to be part of the state and to therefore take on responsibilities within the state because you've tacitly consented. Yeah.
Then the idea of tacit consent and back to belonging to a certain community, behind the idea of a blank slate. What precisely is a blank slate? Where is that piece to be blank and public stuff? What colour is it?
Well, as I sort of said in the introduction, it's very much obviously a sort of semantic realm coming out of a very religious era, in the sense of there not being anything sort of emblazoned on an individual when they're born. You're not either. Oh, yeah, there is someone here. Yeah, I'd say it means that there's no kind of sort of heretical element that you've been born with, or there's no sort of preordained, even in a sort of more Calvinist way. So even without Catholicism, elect or damned, he sees it as you're naturally going to evolve with society. So you start off at a base level, which is essentially a kind of equal state in terms of what your intellectual, your material potentiality is. And you, just like everyone else alongside you, could grow into anything. There's nothing that has predefined your path within society. It's only through you participating in society, becoming educated, becoming informed that society does to you. That's the idea of the tacit consent. That then you have a sort of a definition, an essence to who you are. But it's a little bit almost existential. If you wanted to read it forward to that, it's almost like existence predefines, is a prerequisite to essence. That existence precedes essence. So I'd say in relation to Jack's point,
It's kind of modern
thinking.
value of education, for example.
Yeah.
Potentiality to develop the children then have essentially there was an opportunity for everyone.
Yeah. That's what you understand. Yeah, no, certainly. It's quite a modern idea. I mean, obviously, within boundaries, it's like when he talks about toleration, this is within boundaries. You can't have any radical dissenters and you can't have any Catholics. So, I mean, there are some people who are predefined as sitting outside of the state, which are anyone who is not a Church of England Protestant. So it's quite a strict kind of context. We've just done an introduction, but yeah, I'm Sam, so it's lovely to meet you both. Jack, who you just met, is the co-runner of this. I don't know whether you want to go around the table to say hello. Maybe if you want to.
Yeah, my name is Dara. I just graduated last year from Masters in International Relations.
Like yes, I'm from Azerbaijan. I'm doing my PhD at history, the course here.
Michelle, doing PhD first year. Sum it up. Archival studies, British history, ballet, and imperialism.
Jack, I just finished my master's at philosophy.
What about yourself, guys? Are you studying?
No, I'm not studying.
What drew you to the session?
I've read up about Locke in the past, and I always thought it.
Yeah, well, fantastic. Right.
Yeah, I mean, the keyword for me
Right.
so,
Brilliant.
I love
Fantastic.
You can help yourself to wine or
Yeah, would you like a glass of wine or a glass of water? I won't say no.
and if you want to open the beverage like that.
Perfect.
Wonderful.
Would anyone like to sort of bounce off of what I was just saying? If anyone's got any questions or any sort of points?
Well, I think the only thing I read as well was the because I sort of Hobbes as well. State of nature.
Yeah.
So be political side.
Mm-hmm.
Hobbes organic. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas I think Locke was engagement across the Commonwealth
Yeah.
of people engaged with political society.
Yeah.
But he didn't want that state of nature.
No.
It was logical that they were, as you say, engaged tacitly in this still essentially a sovereign land.
Yes. Yeah. Very much so.
He didn't have any idea that there was republicanism.
No.
There was a logic to why sovereign would be paramount.
Yeah.
And as you said, in his case, logic was positive. Not James.
Exactly.
Who had a sense of choice, a bit of a sovereign they didn't like.
Yeah.
Whereas I think Hobbes would.
Unless for Hobbes, unless it was directly a threat to life, then
It was this sort of progression from Hobbes to a passive consent to a social contract.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And obviously, in the context of a century where there has been chaos, when we talk about political chaos today, I mean, it really is something perennial. It's never unique. I mean, he's writing at a time where you've had a civil war raging across all the counties of England into Ireland, massacres, slaughters, brother on brother, sectarian division. You've had the Restoration. You've then had this sort of move towards what lots of Englishmen at the time are seeing as despotism, with the return of the Stuarts and thereby the associated Catholicism that comes with it, even if they're trying to say that they're Protestants, which they sort of put up this facade of being Protestants after the Restoration. But actually, there's this fear that what was called at the time in pamphlets going around in the 1680s, the engines of tyranny were whirring up again in England because these secret Catholics had returned to power and going to take away that volition that was supposed to be gifted to you as a part of English society. So yes, exactly, it was chaotic.
Yeah, you are Jack.
Yeah. So yeah, certainly.
Chris, yeah.
And Michelle or Mary, do you have any questions? Nothing?
Mulling.
Not yet. Yeah, mulling at the moment. Perfect. And have you both heard of social contract theory as a concept in politics? So last week, 2 weeks ago, we were doing a session on Rousseau, the sort of more, let's say, slightly more left liberal figure. But this series is called Liberty because we're discussing people who fit within what we're defining as a liberal canon. And social contract theory is the idea that if you have a society, you have to have reciprocal obligations to the kind of rights and benefits that you get from society. So in the 17th century through to the 18th century, various scholars were deliberating on this. So from, as Peter was just discussing, Thomas Hobbes, who is often regarded within sort of more early modern kind of period as the first social contract kind of debater or writer. He says that if you don't have society, mankind would fall into anarchy, that it would just be everyone at each other's throats trying to steal each other's things and trying to kill each other to benefit themselves. Rousseau, who we looked at last week, discusses the idea that actually it's society that has corrupted man's natural state, that in a state of nature where there was no big society, society would have been this kind of loving, or at least sort of somewhat reciprocally compassionate world if we hadn't had a kind of corrupting civilization that told us that you need money, material objects, and whatever kind of fashion and everything that was basically going on in Paris in the 18th century as society was commercialising. Locke sits somewhere sort of halfway between those two and says that because you grow up in a society, because you're raised within a certain community, you have obligations to that society because you benefited from an upbringing in that society. So that's the sort of three iterations of what we call social contract theory, and there are plenty more, but those are the kind of three core Enlightenment views of social contract. And then, yeah, I suppose one that I'd pick out, and I don't know, Peter, whether you might be interested in sort of discussing that, but can you sort of see what he thinks the purpose of a government is within society, you know, as it emerges, what is the purpose of government within that society? What anyone else does?
I'm not mistaken, the main idea of the government was to protect the rights of people and deal with the main basic rights, life, property.
Yeah.
So, in order to protect these lives, they have minimize all the intellectual rights of people and just to protect or to guarantee the general stability.
Yeah, exactly.
From
Yes, very much so. Yeah, the threat of any intervention certainly. That's having been. We were just talking about what the purpose, what Locke sees as the purpose of government. And we moved on to sort of
great. Yeah, I love that.
And we were saying about stability, about protecting from the threat of foreign intervention, and maintaining the sort of society that everyone has the ability to benefit from and participate in. What would you say, Jack?
Well, I would, you've got a negative view of nice, but problem is which is in the foreign hand, I guess.
Yeah.
And find that much. And so government is introduced principally mediator as a neutral force enables people lives. Now, I would connect that to another sort of Locke has about what he talks about freedom has to grow by the course of reading knowledge, and in the absence of that, he talks about the kind of measures you would put in place to safeguard somebody, or you have their parents when they're a child. That's why parents, and then in the absence of guarantors and wills and sort of like this, and volumes of human infrastructure place to protect you in ignorance and your ability. What was interesting to me, example he gave, it was never the state itself.
No.
Local people.
Yeah.
So he's got a link. He never said it openly. This is common sense to him that government is possible, but it has a very minor role of killing each other.
Exactly, and that does stem back to the point I was just making contextually in terms of that immediate fear that you could have a tyrant, this Catholic king returning to England, and you have to limit a king's power because everyone was thinking that Protestant England was entrenched, that it was never going to change, and that was the idea through Henry VIII, through all the way, 200 years now of, where am I going? something, I don't know. But, you know, for decades and decades and decades, the idea that the Church of England was now established and that through the Church of England, somewhat liberty was ensured. And the idea that this could actually be returning with despotism and papism and popery and all of these kind of terms that were going around that essentially were the idea that religious dictatorship might return to England. That's why, yeah, the state needs to be limited, because even if you have a benevolent ruler, you could easily fall back with a quick change, easily fall back into despotism. So very much so, the state needs to be limited and power needs to be distributed down rather than maintained as a sort of central force. Very much so. There was something else you said that I was going to respond to. No, I think it was something else. I don't know if anyone else would like to chime in or ask any questions. Or
I don't think it's the parents, it was the father, wasn't it?
yeah, it's very patriarchal. Yeah, yeah.
Father in the absence of the father. Locke was advocating that as long as you weren't a Catholic,
Yeah.
You could be a Protestant, you could be a kind of, you could be non-conformist.
Yes, yeah, and
It was at that degree.
and he was certainly supportive of the Toleration Act that comes in the same year, 1689, when the Toleration Act comes in, which gives non-conformists the right to at least practice their religion. They can't go out and become fully fledged members of the state, though, even then. They can't go to university, they can't hold political positions. So, you know, this great idea that somehow in 1689 England became this tolerant society was still very limited, even with the Toleration Act. Yes, some dissidents were allowed to practice, but they still weren't allowed to take any posts within the state, and certainly not any other faith, whether it's Catholicism, whether it was Judaism, anything. You had it slightly later with an attempt at the Naturalization Act in 1753, but it would be a very long time until any other faith was actually given any sort of status within society. So so there's certainly an element in his thought that is dissidents should be able to practice and you shouldn't be able to enforce it. However, he is still wary that he uses terms like the magistrates, and that's very much linking to a kind of more Calvinist society. So unlike Rousseau, who's looking at a kind of Calvinist society like Geneva, and saying, well, that's the idyllic society because the clergy are virtuous. Well, for him, Geneva's far too authoritarian. It's far too sort of the magistrate dictates to you how you live your life. So yes, he would support dissidents, but he wouldn't support sort of particularly radical Protestants. Yeah.
I think also that the state is, whilst you were a member of the society, the state, I think, principally couldn't. You had a right to property. That was Locke. Mental shift. If you, it wasn't a state where sovereign and the emergence. Well, you started getting those copyright.
Yeah.
It wasn't very individualism, but they didn't have to use it. They had limited power. There was a limit to the state power.
Exactly. And it's very interesting as well, as you say, about the start of copyright, but it's also the start of capitalism, because it's the idea that, so how does he come to the idea that property is one of these three essential rights? Well, he sort of does this rationalizing that he says, well, if I have liberty, if one essential thing we know is that the individual has a freedom from being dictated to, from being forced to do things that they don't want to do. Well, if I have that right, if I put my effort, my energy into doing something, whether that's to build a house or paint a individual liberty resides in that product that I have created. So property becomes almost a representation of the self. So that's why there needs to be this negative freedom for the property, just as there needs to be a negative freedom for the individual. And also the terms negative and positive freedom, we were discussing this last week, but negative freedom is to be free from. So that's the idea of thinkers who discuss negative freedom is to be free from something, so free from oppression, free from dictatorial government, free from being told what to do, how to act, how to practice your faith. Positive freedom, which doesn't come really about until the turn of, I suppose, the turn of the, you could almost say the turn of the 20th century, but sort of through the 1800s, particularly once you get to Mill, positive freedom is the idea that government has a responsibility to enable you to do things. So it's freedom to do, so freedom to go to school, freedom to have a hot meal, to have a roof over your head. That's positive freedom. So in this time, we're only talking about negative freedom, freedom from something, freedom from my property being taken away, freedom from me being forced into chains, freedom from me being, oppressed in any of those iterations. Of course, there are massively excluded elements of society, not only based on faith, which are what Carol Pateman and Charles Mills, if anyone is interested, I would certainly recommend. Charles Mills, the racial contract, and Carol Pateman's the sexual contract, because they discuss these scholars from a very postmodern perspective in the 80s. And you see how, obviously, there are massively excluded elements, and actually how a lot of the issues that we're grappling with today in terms of our Western societies arise from these scholars' ideas of who and how different individuals are included within the social contract, and how certain individuals sit outside the social contract and are kind of semi-part of it and semi-not, and all about, they both say that a lot of the issues we face today arise from those exclusions, but I won't go into that right now. Janet, would you like to move forward with any other comment? I'm just keeping a wary eye on the time because I want us to get to Paine, but
I'm an unreliable source, but I apologise for. I was really interested in systematic defence of the origin of natural rights, because I don't think we don't seem to think like that anymore. But even just, imagine something happens, have to imagine that your landlady, dependent on your income. We would approach a situation like that. I think the first thing that would come into a lot of people's head is like, oh, I'm a self-returning individual, and a problem. There's a lot in about rights of proportional obligations.
Yeah.
And tacit duty to the state. Even just the way he thinks about self-preservation, basic thing you imagine, entails right to property, of yourself, and so once you expend that labour, what common property of all has become yours.
Yeah.
But then
just
how he then
discussing
balances
that. When you went out, we were just talking about the property.
And you mentioned how he balances it, so it's got a right to all the property.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting as well. Yeah. We feel we've lost something in the way we don't seem to think thematically about rights like that anymore. Is that a fair judgment, even?
I think the social contract here, you need to have a period of challenge after. So, you coming in.
Yeah.
But later on, you get 20th century rules. Right, brings the social the idea of rights. In some respects, several things. May go back to Locke, actually think about it and the obligation.
I think it's quite interesting as well, on a side point about rights and duties, that there's another division. We talked about the division between positive and negative rights, but there's also a division in social contract theorists. You have those who are called the contractualists, who believe that there is an ethical standard that sits outside of our kind of body politics, so to speak, so that ethics is something external to the state, and that the state will be built on that external method of ethics. So that you can deduce from that external ethics. So obviously in the church, you could say, well, I'll read scripture and I will take the Gospels, I will take the Ten Commandments, I will take these different ethical standpoints to build my state on and compare to, essentially. But then, sort of relating to what you're saying, Joe, you have then the contractarians who believe that actually our responsibilities, our duties, the way we should behave, actually come from the state, as in they are only emerge as the state emerges. So we don't ever have them until a political state kind of structures itself literally based on necessity, essentially. And that's obviously a Hobbesian view, that like you have the state, there isn't really an external ethical state, and that therefore things like rights emerge actually from the state itself, rather than there being this kind of external idea of where rights, duties, virtues, even ethics sit. And that's the difference between contractualists and contractarians. So yeah, but after Rousseau, you have also, you could argue that someone like Kant is a contractualist, and you could say that other various kind of 19th century thinkers are sort of contractualists, but very early on you have these contractarians who are saying, well, once the state is built, the state will define what the rights, duties, are, rather than there being a kind of ethical standpoint outside. That's sort of a bit of a tangent, but relates to kind of where you were going. Does anyone have any sort of questions about Locke, his thought about chapter 8, before we turn to Paine? Because I'll do a sort of preamble about Paine before we discuss Paine.
Well, I guess that's not trying to say too much. I think the idea of property as well, you know, later, different to land. There was a different concept of land. So, you know, Jane Austen and all has the right to that land. So they still had the freedom.
And do you know actually what a bit of land was called at this time? It was called a liberty.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I just wanted to do that.
So you have the state still own the freehold, but you have the rights to own endeavours, taking the fruits of that. Yeah. Still the state still owns things.
Yeah.
And sovereign still.
Ultimate. Which is exactly why they refer to any allocation of land to anyone at the time as a liberty. Yeah. We will give you a liberty of X acres, because it's something that has been gifted as a freedom that can be taken back. Yes. Yeah. Well, we'll turn to Paine. Okay with that. I'll stand. Right, so now that we've looked at Locke, we'll look at Paine. Thomas Paine emerged from a modest and often unsuccessful early life to become one of the most influential voices of revolutionary and liberal thought. His fiery pamphlet, Common Sense, rallied support for the American Revolution, even being read aloud to troops during their fight against British rule. Paine's subsequent work, The Rights of Man, inspired generations of liberals by denouncing monarchy as a fraud and imposition, and advocating radical reform. Rejecting tradition for its own sake, Paine criticised gradual reformists as condescending elites who pity the plumage but forget the dying bird, emphasising the need for transformative change to address systemic inequalities. Paine's writings resonated with the working class, urging them to claim their rights rather than petition for them. For him, reason was the cornerstone of society, and tradition without justification was mere ignorance. His radical ideas foreshadowed the slow evolution of liberal social contract, culminating in the gradual expansion of suffrage through reforms in the 19th and earlier 20th century. Though incremental change followed this era, Paine's commitment to reason over ritual and ideals over ignorance set the stage for modern democratic thought. So one of his texts, this is just some supplementary stuff before we look at the text we're reviewing. The publication of Thomas Paine's Age of Reason, a term that's used to refer to the Enlightenment in the 18th century, marked both a critique and defense within the Enlightenment's intellectual landscape. Paine was born into a Quaker family, and his liberal values and commitment to reason were shaped by his religious upbringing and the revolutionary fervour of the time. Written largely during his imprisonment in Paris, where he was held as an enemy of the French Revolution, which is slightly ironic, as Jack and I were discussing yesterday, Age of Reason reflects the complexities of an era defined by both faith and scepticism. Paine supported Enlightenment ideals such as reason and rational inquiry, critiquing the corruption of organised religion while affirming a belief in the divine. Like Voltaire, he rejected institutional dogma, but maintained a nuanced perspective on faith, encapsulating the tension between tradition and progress that characterised the Age of Enlightenment. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January 1776, is a foundational text of the American Revolution and a masterwork of political pamphleteering. Paine, a recent immigrant to the American colonies, penned the pamphlet in plain, forceful language that resonated with a wide audience, breaking down complex political ideas into accessible arguments. At its core, Common Sense is an argument for American independence from British rule. Paine denounced monarchy as an inherently corrupt and tyrannical form of government, describing King George III as a royal brute. He advocated for the establishment of a republican government rooted in the consent of the governed, as a more just and equitable system. Paine also tied the cause of independence to universal principles of liberty and natural rights, framing the revolution as not merely a colonial dispute, but part of a broader struggle for human freedom. The context of Common Sense was crucial to its success. In early 1776, tensions between Britain and its American colonies were reaching a boiling point. Events like the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts, and the battles of Lexington and Concord had galvanized colonial resistance. However, many colonists were still undecided about pursuing full independence, and loyalty to Britain remained strong among some. Paine's pamphlet shifted public opinion dramatically by presenting independence as not only necessary, but inevitable. Its timing was also critical, appearing just months before the Declaration of Independence. Common Sense sold over 100,000 copies within a few months, reaching a vast audience and helping to unify disparate colonial voices into a cohesive revolutionary movement. Its impact was immediate and enduring, cementing Paine's reputation as one of the revolution's most influential thinkers. And actually, on A-level courses now, they use Common Sense as one of the main factors. If you do a paper, it's one of the main factors that they put in there for the American Revolution. They obviously talk about economic issues, they talk about political tensions, but actually his pamphlet is now one of the answers you can give. The Rights of Man. The Rights of Man was published in two parts, 1791 and 92. It was a passionate defence of the French Revolution and a powerful critique of hereditary government and aristocracy. I'm not sure he would have been so fond of it 2 years later when he was sitting in a prison at the hands of French revolutionary powers. But written in response to Edmund Burke's reflections on the revolution in France, Paine's work argued that political institutions should be based on reason, equality, and the natural rights of the individuals, rather than tradition or inherited privilege. Paine championed the idea that governments exist to serve the people, not the other way around. and called for sweeping reforms, including universal suffrage, the abolition of aristocratic privileges, and social welfare programs to alleviate poverty. His vision was radical for its time, presenting a blueprint for democratic government and social justice. The context of the rights of man was shaped by the revolutionary fervour of the late 18th century. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, had polarised opinion across Europe, while supporters saw it as a beacon of liberty and progress. Critics, like Burke, viewed it as a dangerous upheaval that threatened social order. Paine's work not only defended the revolution, but also extended its principles to argue for political reform in Britain and beyond. His ideas resonated with the growing demands for democracy and rights among the working classes, but they also provoked outrage among the ruling elite. The sedition forcing him to flee to France. Despite this, The Rights of Man was widely read and remains a seminal text in the history of political thought, influencing movements for democracy and human rights around the world. And sorry, I sort of skipped a bit there, but there's a funny anecdote that if you know William Blake, the poet, Blake and Paine were both, and I meant to put this photo on there because I love it so much, but there's a brass model of it, but Paine and Blake were sitting in a pub, probably not too far away from here, and William Blake had heard that the police, or the sort of militia of the day, were out looking for Thomas Paine because of his seditious writing in The Rights of Man, and it was actually William Blake who saved Thomas Paine's life because he said, "You need to leave now," and he immediately went from that pub to a boat on the Thames, and that's when he left to the New World. So it's quite astonishing that it was Blake who saved such a great thinker. But yeah, a few more questions there, so we can go through those, but Jack, maybe you'd like to start us off with the gobbet that you have.
I was really interested in the references to Burke in The Rights of Man. The criticism of Burke, and I previously read the Reflection on the Revolution in France, Burke's text that I was referring to, and I quite enjoyed it. So their disagreement really clarified for me what theory is about and the themes that these things back and forth. Their fundamental disagreement is whether society should be this kind of hereditary model, where you view society as an intergenerational project that no one can walk away from, or not necessarily walk away from, but radically revive, let's say, like completely like uproot and redefine the term. That would be a better way of thinking of it. All these things just say you have the freedom to go start a new society. Yeah. That's what we saw, and in Burke. But I got the impression in Burke that the main point was that if you're going to have a society, there needs to be some kind of security of the longevity of this project, that the terms on which you've gone it are sort of settled.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the first way you might or there to do. But frame the game we're all going to be playing as the society unfolds. And Burke's big critique of the revolution in France was that these guys had upturned all conceivable notions of law in their society in order to lay down a law. And what is the lawfulness of the uprooting of the law to make a new law? How are you taken seriously? New law you put down once an old law has been completely demolished.
Yeah, yeah.
And this wasn't just an intellectual criticism. He knew France very well, Burke, and he had all these anecdotes from friends there. They were talking about how the military had been completely, the revolutionary military, completely disintegrated, but no longer had any discipline. Yeah. They were just rioting. They were going around and pillaging places. They were very embarrassed about this fact at the cue of the revolution. All of which is to say, I would side with Burke on their debate whether hereditary society is preferable to new view, where the social contract, as Rousseau says, is echoing, is the more voluntary act, the kind of thing that we all just withdraw from and rewrite at a whim's notice, and you see what that does. The Constitution, sometimes more bloody others, of course, but still say that maybe going for a sixth republic soon. It's like in less than 200 years.
Which I think makes him much more of a sort of positivist when it comes to human nature, which is another one of these kind of binaries here, which is like negativists, those who are skeptical about the idea of what we are as individuals if we were left alone unseen, and positivists in terms of those who think that we would actually be better in our own kind of uncoerced, unoppressed kind of manner. I'd say Locke, I don't know about you, Peter, I don't know about you, Jack, but I'd say in terms of his view of whether he's a positivist or sort of more negative human nature thinker, I'd say he sits kind of at a sort of medium where he kind of thinks, simply on the basis of the sort of idea of tabula rasa, that we're not really particularly good or bad, we're sort of just... so what I'd say, what the point I'm getting at is Paine almost feels like he's sitting closer to Rousseau here in the idea that it's those laws that have corrupted man. So for him, unlike Burke sees social development as something which is a good thing, that we've created these laws, we've had this evolution of a society, and that is what is improving mankind. Whereas for someone like Paine, he falls closer to Rousseau in the sense that actually, no, those are the things that have corrupted mankind, so why not smash them and do away with them and bring in something revolutionary and fresh and new. So yeah, I'd say he certainly fits closer there. However, he certainly sits close to Locke in the sense of this primacy on individual liberty, and that cannot be infringed, and that maintaining these kind of traditions and these sort of sort of ornaments of the past are redundant for a productive change in society at that point in time. I don't know how you what would you say, Jack, in response to that?
I wanted to ask, the line in the declaration, the actual declaration, right, once we get there, I think it's in the French document. Article 3, the nation is the source of all benefit. And I wondered what if that was contradiction or not, I have no idea, of the insistence on the individual liberty. It's sort of in Rousseau a bit as well. On the one hand, there's that radical intrinsic liberty, the sort of kind of power. On the other hand, both of them had this idea that the freedom, moral freedom, I think, comes from the whole. Is that a tension?
I don't know. I suppose, again, if you then link it to Locke, society is formative for the individual. So the individual can only sort of self-actualize, flourish through a educational and supportive nation, society, state, whatever. So I suppose that's sort of an attempt at me saying that you can synthesize it, but I can completely see the tension. I don't know how anyone else they would like to chime in.
I know the 19th century education everybody, individual. Or fixed society, whereas Paine societies existed, and particular education to kind of everybody had much more about the individual as still very much hierarchical. Within that society, but not short of were individual. They were, I mean, like we said last time about the Native American society, there was a comparison of that was a society that hadn't developed
Just have comments or questions or
say if it's the idea of change. So I mean they're both same in the sense that there's also agents of change and so Spain, but the difference is Jack, yeah, he is the method. So Paine is more from his like thought of bringing that change by through non how can I like bringing that pain by any means.
Yeah,
it could
yeah.
be like bloody means or like
Exactly.
that.
Yeah.
Whereas Locke is more like reform.
Yeah.
But also in order not to break the law and order. So when you it's just the same thing, but it's just the method that I would like to see that change.
Doing it, and obviously Burke supports the American Revolution, whilst not supporting the French Revolution.
So this is a yeah, right. And modern people who haven't read some of the older conservatives, they would find it quite surprising.
Yeah.
But Burke's conservatism has very distinctive norm change. The heart of it, and the panic on the first page of those, that part of the healthy government is change, but the point is that the change is found within the tradition. But it knows how to change well. And so Burke points to 1688, and the whole disagreement about what happened in England. The awful thing. So
The removal test acts, which were basically soldiers within the English army had to do a test, essentially, to prove that they weren't Catholics. And he removed those tests and appointed quite a lot of officers who were pretty well known secret Catholics as leading officers.
So Burke reads that not as a revolution, it's called a revolution, but it wasn't in Burke's eyes. But what happened was problems were encountered, problems could be accounted for in the framework of the law. It's a bit of an unconventional but perfectly legitimate shift.
Yeah.
We call it an exception, but within the framework. And then you're doing the same thing. So there was no radical break, just a bit of an uncertain time. Everything worked as it was supposed to. The first time it's like the revolution thing. The revolution is not different, but I did a radical break with the nation. It's that continuity that becomes powerful. Sponsors the ideology very arbitrary, but quite a whole number of people stand together for that. Thoroughly equate.
Yeah. I suppose Paine's argument, and one of his most famous passages, is what I read out in one of the pieces, which is that his view of someone like Burke would be that, yes, they're both arguing for change, but that passage, he pities the plumage but forgets the dying herd. So you're obsessing about kind of, for Paine, someone like Burke is obsessing about kind of small things that will gradually society. Whereas for him, he's saying, well, look at all the suffering, look at all the oppression, look at all the freedoms being taken away from individuals. You're sort of messing around trying to solve little issues here and there, but actually we need to address the fundamental issues that have wronged masses of society. It's a very evolutionary approach that he's taking.
Well, I think you mentioned about the Quaker.
Yeah.
Father's
Yes.
mother was. I think the idea of that Quakerism bow down to people, you mindful, you care to people. The idea that the all of it came from the. There's always that sort of kind of very skeptical or told what to do. Therefore, the rights of man, the rights of man is therefore, as many birds, Berkshire has inherent sort of rights in its DNA. Paine sort of individual has therefore they come together and decide appropriate thing to do. That sort of embedded in a Quakerism.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah.
Quite different.
And obviously a certain separatism is obviously inherent in Quakerism as well. The idea of kind of separating from main societies we've discussed about at that time, these kind of more puritanical groups who were quite happy to separate themselves from the kind of main body of society and form their kind of little visions of utopia or whatever within that society too.
And I think it's important that he went to America, he went to Pennsylvania.
Yeah, yeah.
Pennsylvania was a Quaker state. Yeah. So, though I think I was not given and allowed a Quaker burial.
No.
Because he actually not being Quaker, but he went to America.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions?
How we've completely lost our heads suddenly, and a bunch of people rose together because we're in the land of do-it-yourself and free thinking and independent thought, and a whole bunch of people in to fix problems. Just made me think of what's going on now, obviously. Yeah.
I do wonder whether there's a contextual element there as well, and we were discussing this the last 2 weeks ago about Rousseau and his views within his time compared to today, which is this idea of the small state versus the large state, and this relates to what you're saying, which is that Paine was looking at quite small communities within the New World, and what he was envisaging is what he's looking at really quite similar to what we were saying about Rousseau, which is that his kind of ideal state ultimately is actually quite a small state. So as if, like in the US, a state would have its almost ultimate authority over itself. And trying to expand these ideas to such a mammoth country or nation as America now, or as France, when we've discussed Rousseau, doesn't work because they all rely on at least having some form of ability to have a sort of interaction with your neighbour and be able to discuss things within a kind of civil debate is the idea.
I think that's giving Trump too much credit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Philosophical background. I think purely I'm not sure. Trump's version of the public.
No, but trying to come to some sort of understanding of why the people live there.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely can't put it in Trump's head.
Yeah.
It is pure greed, but why that attracted them suddenly, with the land of don't tell me what to do. Yeah.
Yeah. However, the social responsibility element perhaps is lost because because of such a large landmass. I mean, when you're taking ideas that were formed within societies that were so small and then trying to base them on an entrenched constitution, like in America, that takes ideas from this time, but then extrapolates them to a kind of larger landmass that they weren't thinking about at this time. Can you really even implement an idea of Paine's in a modern state that's so large compared to such a small community? Yeah, that's obviously such a massive contextual shift.
And there is a biological link. Okay. They sort of need to build to live in ideas of larger hours and understand people believing one to bring a lot of power structures back down to the level where maybe the tangible to fail and therefore better exercise on the problem with the big society. Whereas in a small society, obviously distributed, you see very clearly what your good is. Where, depending on you, and we have the luxury of the idea that we have obligations to others is knocking on your door in the way it was 100 years. Yes. So no one's starving, obviously, because of you. You need house building.
Yeah, whereas in a smaller state,
right.
you see that more directly.
Yeah, right. No need to go out and hunt.
And clearly his ideas didn't fit well with a large society even in his day, because, as we saw in the Age of Reason section, when he goes to France, his ideas of taking rights, not petitioning for them, isn't particularly well liked by the revolutionary French authorities, and they arrest him. So a large state really doesn't react well, even though he's partly inspired by that movement. He's also arrested by that movement. And I suppose what I would move to then in kind of more closing discussion points would be, how do we see Locke's influence then directly on Paine? Now we've all got some ideas of Locke and Paine. I mean, a good point in terms of the idea of change, and Locke certainly believes in that too. But how is Locke influencing Paine? How can we see that thread from Locke to Paine? Or where are there splinters where there's a difference?
I guess Locke is the idea of some level of agency. Idea that state of nature was not this sort of hell.
Yeah, not to be British.
Essentially, had the potential to authority to sovereign. It kind of lessened the power which but there was, I think, whereas
Locke, Paine, Hobbes.
Yeah. Hobbes would say, look, once you've sorted it, you have to change the Locke says actually there was evidence of individuals.
And like Jack said, he's quite specific about it, because he doesn't support, in 1680 or 85. I think it's 1685. The Duke of Monmouth lands in Lyme Regis, south of England. And Locke and his co-conspirators who will take part in the Rye House plot to try and usurp James do not support the Duke of Monmouth who arrives in Lyme Regis and tries to rally troops in the West Country because they believe that he's just in it for self-interest. He's not in it to actually fundamentally return Britain to a good society. So on the point that you're both making, yes, he believes that there can be some change of ruler to enable a good society, but he certainly doesn't allow any old person to say, oh, well, just because I'm a different ruler, I might be better. There has to be a grounding for why a ruler should usurp James II, and the Duke of Monmouth did not fit that, and Lord Russell's wife said something along the lines, it's clearly Monmouth's self-interest, unlike my husband who led the Rye House plot there, Russell, in later, in 1607 or something. So yeah, certainly, because there's a couple of attempts to usurp James, and only one of them is seen by someone like Locke as a genuine attempt to usurp the current ruler. And it shouldn't just be done over and over again for the sake of it. It has to have a solid grounding to be able to justify the usurpation. Any other thoughts around the table? Any questions, whether it's on Locke, Paine, their influence, their time? Very philosophical question.
Well, I think actually this is the interesting thing for me when I read, I didn't pay much attention, but in all